The atmosphere in the hearing room was tense. The chairs were packed, the lights too bright, and the buzz in the air indicated that something big was about to unfold. Coney Barrett, the respected Supreme Court Justice, sat at the front, maintaining her usual calm demeanor. She was no stranger to scrutiny, but today felt different. There was an undeniable weight in the room, a sense of impending consequence. It all started when Elon Musk, the billionaire entrepreneur and Tesla CEO, tweeted an innocuous question on social media, something that had the power to upend everything. "Where did the federal funds go?" he asked. His tweet was simple, but the implications were anything but. Within hours, the hashtag #FollowTheMoney was trending. Musk had always had a knack for drawing attention to things others overlooked, and this time, his attention had turned to a new target: Coney Barrett's handling of federal funding. Amy had been overseeing a number of federal programs in her capacity, working with various departments to ensure that funds designated for housing, healthcare, and education were allocated properly. On the surface, everything seemed in order, but when Musk's question gained traction, reporters dug deeper into the distribution of those funds. What they found was alarming. Projects were listed, but the recipients were ghost organizations. In some cases, the addresses didn't even exist. The silence from Barrett's office was deafening. Musk was relentless. In a matter of days, he released a thread on Twitter. It detailed inconsistencies in the way federal grants were being distributed across several states. What seemed like a political game to some was quickly turning into a systemic issue of mismanagement and possible corruption. One of the key areas of concern was a particular set of educational grants that appeared to be funneled into shell companies with no actual educational output. Elon's accusations were not made lightly. His facts were sharp, and he had the documents to back them up. By the time the hearing began, Coney Barrett, who had long been viewed as a rock in the judicial system, found herself under the microscope. Musk had made the issue too big to ignore. The hearing that would follow was not just about defending a policy or proving a point, it was about the future of trust in government itself. As Musk's allegations gained steam, an unexpected figure entered the stage: Pam Bondi. A former Attorney General of Florida, Bondi had always had a sharp eye for legal matters and was known for her unflinching stance on accountability. She had been brought in by Musk's team to provide her expertise on the matter. Bondi, with her signature no-nonsense attitude, wasted no time. During her testimony, she made it clear that the way Barrett's office had handled the funds was a mess. She described the situation as a quiet disaster and compared it to past cases of mismanagement that had rocked the public trust. With each passing day, the media began to shift its tone. The story was no longer about a political feud, it was about a massive failure of oversight. Stories that had once been buried in press releases were now front-page headlines. Reporters discovered that some of the nonprofit organizations Barrett's office had worked with had dissolved months ago, yet still received millions in federal funds. It was as if the programs were running in name only. No one could explain where the money had gone, or worse, what it had been used for. By the time Musk took the stand, the room was full. He was cool, collected, and ready to point out what had been overlooked for too long. "This isn't about states," he began, his voice echoing in the silence of the chamber. "This is about systems. Systems that failed, that allowed this to happen under our noses." He clicked through a series of slides showing side-by-side comparisons between the funds allocated in New York, Coney Barrett's jurisdiction, and those in Florida. The contrast was stark. Florida's numbers were transparent, tracked, and reviewed regularly. New York's, under Barrett's supervision, were scattered, hard to follow, and disorganized. It was clear that the funds were being mismanaged, and worse, that no one seemed to have a clear explanation of where they had gone. Coney Barrett's response was nothing like the composed, articulate persona that had long defined her. She remained silent throughout much of the testimony, and when it was her turn to speak, her words seemed rehearsed. She referred to the situation as an overreaction and insisted that everything was under control. But when asked about specific instances of missing funds, she hesitated, offering only vague promises of reviews and audits that would take some time. Pam Bondi quickly fired back, calling Barrett's response insufficient. "We're not talking about discouraging equity," Bondi said in a fiery interview later. "We're talking about discouraging corruption and inefficiency. If Judge Barrett can't explain where the money went, she should step aside." The media was now in full swing, and public opinion began to shift. Polls indicated a drop in trust for Barrett, with many questioning whether the government could be trusted to handle taxpayer money. The pressure was building, an invisible weight that Amy Coney Barrett could no longer ignore. As the hearing concluded, there was a heavy sense that this was only the beginning. The questions had only begun to pile up, and the answers, if they were coming at all, were no longer sufficient. The hearing was over, but the battle was far from won. For Amy Coney Barrett, the days following the session felt like an unrelenting storm. Every news outlet seemed to be dissecting her every word, questioning her integrity, her competence, her ability to lead. But it wasn't just the press that was applying pressure. The public's demand for answers had reached a fever pitch. Across the country, calls for accountability were echoing in town halls, on social media, even in private conversations among lawmakers. Amy had always been an enigma in the public eye. A strict constitutionalist with an impeccable legal career, she had long been hailed as a fierce protector of the law. But now her reputation was at stake, and the light that had once shone on her as a rising star in the judicial system now seemed to expose a different side, one that was unwilling or unable to confront the deep flaws in the system she oversaw. It was mid-morning when the first signs of a shift began to appear. A correction, barely noticeable at first, flashed across the bottom of a news channel's ticker. New York federal grant records show discrepancies. Multiple organizations flagged for irregularities. The tone had changed. What was once a political attack was now looking more like a full-blown scandal. The story was no longer about Musk's accusations, it was about the evidence. And the more evidence came to light, the more difficult it became to ignore. Elon Musk, meanwhile, was relentless. After the hearing, he didn't fade into the background as most expected. Instead, he doubled down. His social media presence became a beacon for others who were asking the same questions he had posed. He posted detailed charts, side-by-side comparisons of funding records between New York and Florida, showing that Florida's systems were transparent and well-documented, while New York's were scattered, inconsistent, and full of missing pieces. But it wasn't just about the numbers. Musk's message was clear. This wasn't a partisan issue, it was about accountability. His posts went viral. Millions of retweets, thousands of comments. Everyday citizens were now tagging their governors, demanding transparency in how their states spent federal funds. For the first time in a long while, the public wasn't asking for change, they were demanding it. And all the while, Barrett remained eerily silent. As the days wore on, the silence became more deafening. The public expected answers, and they were no longer satisfied with vague promises. Local news stations began to pick up the story in full force. Investigative reporters were following Musk's lead, digging into the specifics of the funds that had been allocated but never seemed to reach their intended targets. The investigation led them to a shocking discovery. Several of the nonprofit organizations that had received millions in grants had long since ceased to exist. One had even been registered under an address that didn't exist. A breaking news segment that aired on one of the major networks confirmed what many had feared. Amy Coney Barrett's office had been distributing funds to defunct organizations, some of which had been inactive for years. The story was growing, and so was the public's outrage. Behind closed doors, the pressure on Barrett intensified. Lawmakers from both sides of the aisle began to call for hearings of their own, asking for independent audits to be conducted in their states. Governors across the country were quietly starting to ask their budget directors to review their own federal spending programs. The weight of the situation was beginning to sink in for Barrett. What had once been a manageable issue was now a full-scale crisis. Then, something unexpected happened. Pam Bondi, who had emerged as one of Musk's most vocal allies, made an announcement on national television. "This isn't about partisan politics. It's about a system that's broken," she said, her voice calm but unwavering. "This isn't just about New York. It's about every state. If we can't trust how our tax dollars are being spent, then what can we trust?" The statement struck a nerve. The backlash against Barrett was no longer confined to Musk supporters or Bondi's base. It was becoming a nationwide issue, and no one, not even Barrett, could afford to ignore it. That night, Amy's office released a brief statement. "We are aware of the ongoing concerns regarding the allocation of federal funds. We are in the process of reviewing all claims internally." But the vague statement did little to calm the storm. The public wasn't looking for vague assurances anymore. They were looking for results. The skepticism was growing, and Amy knew she couldn't hide behind her carefully crafted persona forever. The following day, an unexpected twist unfolded. A bombshell report from a local New York journalist surfaced. The reporter had followed up on several addresses listed in the federal funding records. 3 of the locations were abandoned, with no sign of the organizations that were supposed to be there. One address led to a warehouse with no obvious purpose. It was damning. Within hours, the story was picked up by major outlets. Social media erupted once again, this time with a hashtag that gained traction quickly. #WhereIsTheMoney. The story had shifted from an isolated scandal to a national movement. Now, the question wasn't just where the money had gone, it was why the system had allowed this to happen in the first place. In Washington, a few brave lawmakers began to take action. They introduced a proposal for the Federal Grants Transparency Act, which would require all states to disclose the recipients of federal grants and provide quarterly reports on their use. It was clear that they saw the writing on the wall. If this didn't get fixed now, the public would never trust their government again. As soon as the proposal hit the news, Musk's response was swift. He posted a simple emoji, a flashlight, on his Twitter account. The message was unmistakable. He had shown a light on the issue, and now, the country was watching. The pressure was no longer just on Barrett, it was on every politician who had let this system persist. But Barrett wasn't done yet. She still had one final card to play. The days following the announcement of the Federal Grants Transparency Act were unlike anything Amy Coney Barrett had ever experienced. The pressure on her was suffocating. Every day, the headlines grew more damning, and the calls for accountability grew louder. Public sentiment had shifted. The same people who had once viewed Barrett as a paragon of legal virtue now saw her as the embodiment of the system's failure. And as the media continued to hammer away at the missing funds, it became impossible for her to maintain the semblance of control she had clung to for so long. But even amid the storm, Amy held her ground. She refused to concede to the growing tide of public opinion. Her office issued a statement saying they were committed to further review and internal accountability, but those words rang hollow now. Musk's relentless campaign had shown the world a different reality, a reality where the truth could no longer be ignored. By the time Congress returned to session, the heat had only intensified. The hearings on federal spending were scheduled in multiple states, each one more scrutinized than the last. The bipartisan push for the Federal Grants Transparency Act was gaining momentum by the hour. What had started as an isolated push from a handful of lawmakers was now a widespread movement. Both Republicans and Democrats were rallying behind the bill, unwilling to be caught on the wrong side of public opinion. The American people had spoken, and they demanded answers. Musk didn't attend the hearings. He didn't need to. His work was done. Through his social media posts, his investigative reporting, and his insistence on shining a light on the corruption, he had become the face of the movement. His role had never been about making speeches or grandstanding. It was about providing the evidence, the cold, hard proof that could not be dismissed. And the evidence was damning. Investigative journalists, working tirelessly in the wake of Musk's posts, had uncovered further discrepancies in the distribution of funds. One report traced the money from New York all the way to out-of-state bank accounts, some of which were tied to political action committees with dubious connections. Others had disappeared entirely, as if they had been erased from existence. The findings were meticulously documented and published, one piece at a time, creating a cascade of new revelations that only fueled the fire. What had once been a question of mismanagement was now clearly a story of systematic abuse. By the end of the month, the momentum for the Federal Grants Transparency Act had reached an all-time high. More than 100 lawmakers had signed on in support, including powerful voices from both parties. The bill, which once seemed like a far-fetched idea, was now on the verge of becoming law. Its passage was imminent, and with it, the system Amy Coney Barrett had spent years protecting was about to change forever. Meanwhile, Amy's silence had become her greatest enemy. No longer was she the calm, collected judge who had stood tall in the face of controversy. Now, she was the subject of scorn, not just from her political opponents but from her own allies. The media had savaged her. Lawmakers who had once been loyal now distanced themselves. Some even began to call for her resignation. But Amy refused to step down. She maintained that she had acted in good faith and had done nothing wrong. But as the days went by, it became clearer to everyone, Amy Coney Barrett had lost control of the narrative. The pressure had mounted too high, and the weight of the evidence was undeniable. In the final hours before the bill was set to pass, Amy called a press conference. There were no advisors by her side this time, no reassuring faces or carefully crafted talking points. The room was quiet, and for the first time in her career, Barrett looked uncertain. Her once steely resolve had cracked. She stepped up to the podium, paper in hand, and addressed the room in a voice that trembled slightly. "I understand the anger. I understand the frustration," she began, her words carefully measured. "But let me be clear, this is not an attack on the principle of equity. This is not an attack on the work that many of you have devoted your lives to. What we are dealing with here is a systemic failure in oversight, and that is something we must address together." She paused, gathering her thoughts before continuing. "I am committed to making sure this does not happen again, but I will not be bullied. I will not be intimidated into resigning. We will fix this." It was a last-ditch effort to reclaim her dignity, but it was too late. The damage had been done. The public no longer trusted her, and the lawmakers who had stood by her now had to contend with the growing tide of support for transparency. Amy's speech did little to quell the anger that had built up over the weeks. The country had seen what Musk had uncovered, and they had seen the lack of action from those in power. In the days that followed, the Federal Grants Transparency Act was passed with overwhelming support. It was hailed as a victory for the American people, proof that, even in the face of entrenched political power, accountability could prevail. Musk didn't celebrate the win with fanfare or press releases. He simply posted a single tweet: "Mission accomplished." The aftermath was just as swift as the victory. Barrett, despite holding on to her position for now, found herself isolated within her own party. Her reputation was tarnished beyond repair. As the months passed, the investigations continued, and more revelations came to light, but none could undo the damage that had been done to her political career. Meanwhile, Musk continued to focus on the bigger picture. He had exposed a broken system and, in doing so, had changed the conversation around accountability in government. The tide had turned, and now the entire country was watching. The era of unchecked spending and opaque government programs had come to an end. For Amy Coney Barrett, the cost of that change had been high. But in the end, it wasn't her legal acumen that had been tested, it was her ability to adapt to a world that was no longer willing to turn a blind eye to corruption. And in that test, she had failed. As the country moved forward, one thing was clear: the days of hiding behind political power were over. The people had demanded transparency, and they had gotten it. And at the center of it all was one man, Elon Musk, the unlikely hero who had brought down the system with nothing more than hard data and a relentless pursuit of the truth. And with that, the story came to its inevitable end. The system had been shaken. The truth had been exposed. And for all of the political power players who thought they could keep their secrets, the light had come, and it wasn't going away.